Thanks, Jim. That was awesome. It was awesome. Really looking forward to. I mean, the book was fun. I read it back when it came out and stuff like that. And it was. But to have you here and talk about it was a lot of fun. So, Henry Chappell is a field reporter for the Land Report and writes a regular column for Texas Wildlife. He's going to be reading from his most recent book, Silent We Stood, which won the 2014 Western Writers of American Spur Award for the best historical novel. Henry has been a full-time freelance writer since 1997. His first novel, The Callings, was a 2003 Spur Award finalist in the Western Writers of America Best First Novel category. And his second novel, Blood Kin, was a finalist for the same award in 2005 for the novel of the West category, as well as runner-up for the TCU Texas Book Award. I'm very excited about Henry reading from this book. This is a very important, overlooked topic, is the anti-slavery movement that has existed outside of Dallas in Texas here prior to the Civil War that I didn't know anything about really until I started reading about Henry's novel. And it's really very, very interesting. It really sets up Texas in an interesting way, that it's not the Deep South, it's not the West, it's something very different. It's very different. And Henry's book does a really good job of that. So thanks very much for reading for us, Henry.
Thank you all for coming tonight, and big thanks to Malvern Books for having me here. It's a little bit intimidating to walk up here with a book after Mark and Susan entertained us the way they did. I'm going to read a few passages from Silent We Stood and tell you a little bit about it between the passages. About 10 years ago, I was working on a sequel to my second novel, Bloodkin, and it wasn't going well. I realized later I didn't really want to write a sequel, but thankfully one morning, Sunday morning, I came across an item in the Dallas Morning News about a disastrous fire that erupted in Dallas in July of 1860, and it destroyed the entire business section of the small town of Dallas. Well, this was the first I'd heard of it, and I considered myself a pretty serious amateur historian, so I started reading a little further, and as it turns out, I learned that Dallas, in the months leading up to the Civil War, was in the grip of just absolute paranoia about abolitionist intrigue and a slave rebellion, and basically northern agitators down in their country causing trouble. And so when this fire erupted, this paranoia came to a head. They gathered up a bunch of the slaves in Dallas County. There really weren't that many slaves in Dallas County, but they gathered up several dozen, interrogated them, and basically fingered three ringleaders, accused them of arson and insurrection. 16 days later, they were hanged on the banks of the Trinity River. No trial. Dallas went on, was rebuilt, Civil War happened, the rest is history. Very likely, there was no arson involved. Very likely it was the result of carelessness. The whole town was made of wood, all the men smoked cigars, and they used these unstable prairie matches. So almost certainly 3 innocent men died on the banks of the river that day. However, that didn't make a very good story, does it? So, started thinking, started doing some more reading. Historians generally say there was very little Underground Railroad activity in Texas, and that's true. However, Olmsted and a lot of the chroniclers from the 19th century reported runaway slaves, especially in South Texas, generally heading south to Mexico where slavery was illegal. Now, given the distances involved, these people almost certainly had some kind of help. Perhaps not the elaborate networks that were available in the Upper South and in the North, helping slaves to Canada, but there were people involved. And so I started thinking, what if something really were happening beneath the city leaders' noses? What if something really was going on? Started thinking about the fire, and so I began to imagine this little band of abolitionists working in secret within this close-knit Dallas society, doing what they could to help slaves toward freedom, primarily southward toward Mexico. If they'd gone north, it had gone across Indian territory, which had its own kinds of dangers. And so this developed over time, and this voice came to me, and it was the first real voice from this story. It was an elderly man, and he was dictating an account to his daughter. And I was well into the novel before I came to understand even who this guy was. He's only one voice in the novel of many. And I'm not going to tell you who he is. If you want to know, we can fix you right up. But I'll start by reading the first dictation. And these are interspersed through the book as the story comes together. Father's Reminiscence, transcribed July 24th, 1911. If after all that I'm about to tell you, or admit, you think I'm a coward, imagine standing amid a mob watching as 3 condemned men are kicked off a bluff above the Trinity River. They roll and careen off of roots and stumps, stumble out into cracked mud below the riverbank. One of them cries out, his shoulder's been torn from its socket. All have been stripped of their shirts. Filth clings to their bloody backs. Above them on Commerce Street, workmen resurrect a vile and venal town that burned 16 days prior. A cloud of ash still hangs in the air. The hammering and sawing never stop, even for public murder. Someone had to pay. Try to imagine it. For 50 years, I've been unable to forget. That day on the riverbank, I looked into the eyes of one of those 3 men an instant before a mail clerk named Randolph Spurge kicked a barrel from beneath his feet and left him dangling. The next 2 in line watched as ropes were slung over other limbs. I've seen his eyes every day since he sought mine in those last seconds, but I sleep with a clear conscience. I saw no accusation there, only sorrow and resolve, love and a measure of relief when he knew I would hold my tongue and let him hang. Contrary to popular perception, Texas was not, especially North Texas, was not uniformly pro-Confederate, pro-slavery, pro-secession. There actually was quite a spirited pro-union movement up in the rural areas north of Dallas. There was a lot of violence leading up to the Civil War between these factions. There's actually a sort of a low-grade guerrilla war going on up in the Sulphur Breaks regions north of Dallas, up along the Sulphur River. And so it was a very, very complex time. Lincoln's election, secession loomed. An abolitionist or a pro-union person had better be very, very careful about who they talk to. One wrong word to the wrong person could end up being fatal. In fact, in Fort Worth, a suspected abolition was hanged, burned, dismembered. I mean, that's what you faced, okay? So my characters, like the actual abolitionists in the North and in the Upper South, came out of the church, the Methodist church in this case. And so the spiritual leader of this little band of abolitionists is a man named Ignatius Boddicker. Brother Ig, as he's known. He's a rotund, melancholic preacher, but very charismatic, very gifted. And he vacillates between just, reckless or almost reckless abandon toward taking action against slavery and what he thinks of as prudence. But at night, when he's looking up and facing himself, he says, is this prudence or is this just cowardice? So there are 2 other characters. These both are preachers. These are Methodist preachers from Iowa, and they are extremely, extremely reckless. They're much like John Brown. I mean, they hold nothing back. They taunt local authorities, and they're holding out in the thickets up north of Dallas, hiding out with runaway slaves, and will eventually hide out with Confederate deserters. And these people, because they are so brave and have so much faith that it will all work out, they overshadow Ig, they stand over him like a shadow because he thinks or he wonders if he might not just be a coward. And so here is a passage in which he and his wife Rachel, who's also a spirited abolitionist, but again secretly within Dallas society, they meet the legendary Parson Zephaniah Newton after a tent sermon on Sunday morning. On the third Sunday in July 1859, Parson Zephaniah Newton, formerly of Iowa and more recently of Bonham, Gainesville, Denton, Sherman, Paris, Preston, Honey Grove, and Ladonia, Texas, suspected Northern agitator, friend of notorious abolitionist Jonah Chambers, alleged disciple of Parsons Solomon McKinney and William Blount, accused Ig Boddicker of cowardice. That the parson made his accusation in Rachel's presence further confirmed Ig's theories about inborn northern brusqueness. Ig was already annoyed with himself for preaching a tepid sermon from the 10th chapter of Matthew on standing up to wickedness and overcoming adversity. After he greeted the congregation and accepted a dinner invitation to the Van Husses, Rachel took his arm and gave him a sympathetic look that said, "Yes, you were off today, and I know that you know it and feel badly." She'd offer detailed commentary after dinner had revived him. The men had already taken down the tent and had loaded it in the wagon. The creekside meadow was nearly empty save for some skinny cattle grazing near the top of the rise. Ig was about to help Rachel into the wagon when a short, slight, freckled, blond-bearded man who'd sat near the front called him. Clearly he was not a Southerner. Ig stopped. The man strode toward him. He wore a dusty gray suit and no hat. His white shirt was buttoned at the neck, no tie, filthy. "Reverend, I want a word with you," he said. Ig held out his hand warily. He was used to warm greetings, not a stranger wanting a word with him. They shook hands. "Zephaniah Newton," the man said. Ig glanced around. "Ah, Parson, your reputation precedes you. Honored to make your acquaintance," and nervous. Fortunately, there seemed to be no one else around. Perhaps no one in the congregation recognized the little troublemaker. "I'll be direct, sir," Newton said. "Your vagueness appalls me. Say what you mean or step aside for a stouter man of God." "Your imprudence appalls me," Rachel said. Where's your congregation? Your reckless behavior has gotten you run out of every town where you might have done some good." "Precisely," Ig said. Newton was in for it now. Rachel's neck was flushed. He'd just get out of the way and watch. "Do you suppose the Apostle Paul concerned himself with prudence?" Newton said. "Do you think Christ allowed himself 1 second of intimidation before he laid righteous siege to the venal temple? You vainglorious little troll." She was smiling now, lips taut over her teeth. "Has it occurred to you that we are not in Syracuse or Boston or Philadelphia? A man might have to suffer the law of the land, but he needn't obey it if it's in opposition to God's law. To do so is to condone it. At least that's what I thought I heard your husband say this morning." Newton's blue eyes were wild, gleaming. He'd found a worthy opponent. Ig began to feel left out. "While I admire your forthrightness, I'll thank you for not endangering our work here." Newton laughed. Your work or your hides? Which do you fear I'll endanger, Reverend? Which do you hold most dear? Why do you keep looking around? The important discourse is right here. Are you late for an appointment? Don't let me detain you." Rachel said, "You're a dangerous man. A danger to the Negroes you claim to help, and a danger to all people of goodwill. No different than that absurd Captain Brown who kept the slavers in Missouri and Kansas in such a state of agitation that no one could safely move passengers along the roads, all the while disparaging responsible work. It's perfectly obvious you're of the same ilk. Why don't you go back up to the border counties? I'm sure they'll write about you in the newspaper up there. Perhaps someone will even honor you with the daguerreotype. You misjudge me." "I judge you rightly, sir, and I'm tiring of your company. Surely you have business elsewhere, Emmaus perhaps, or Corinth or Rome. Surely I'm not overestimating your aspiration. Why, I doubt a man of your godliness need bother with a ferry." "Deflect the truth then, but I'll ask this. Your work, as you call it, what does it consist of and what have you accomplished? Do you think your tremulous queries to the north have escaped me? The hills up there are rife with free soilers, but our kin to the south in Dallas County are all too timid to ask for help. Oh, the word might get out. We might approach the wrong man, so years pass and the evil continues unabated. We've recently moved our first passenger," Ig said. "Yes, Peter, I've spoken with Brother Silas Hemby, who I understand sent him to you and your people. Who else do you know between here and the Red River?" Ig said, we're concentrating our efforts southward with considerable progress. Thank you. Southward, how many miles to Mexico? But oh, to the north, Winford Skaggs' murder has you spooked. Afraid of burning, are you, Reverend? There are many ways to burn, some more lengthy than others. Rachel said, do you have any idea of the work we did in Kansas and Missouri? What were you doing then? I don't recall hearing your name, little righteous man. Well, you wouldn't have, not there in free Lawrence. Yes, sir, there in the great free territory of Kansas, they'll have no slavery. They'll see it abolished, for it interferes with the white man's wage. As for Negroes, free or fugitive, well, they'll have none of them either. Get them on up to Iowa or Detroit or Chatham as fast as you can. New England Immigrant Aid Company, more like White Immigrant Aid Company, I couldn't stomach it. Ig suddenly felt dirty. Let's not be reduced to comparing virtuous acts. Newton said nothing for a moment. He seemed to be considering Ig's comment. Well then, know that you'll be tested very soon. I say that with utter certainty. Rachel rolled her eyes. Oh, listen, Ignatius, he's prophesying now. I am truly awed and humbled. Zephaniah Newton said, I'd best be getting back to the woods. I'm anticipating a productive association with my Dallas kindred. You'll be hearing from me soon, Mrs. Bodker. He bowed slightly and walked away toward the creek. His pants below his knees were stiff with red mud. Dear God, Rachel said, what an insufferable little bantam. And the last thing we need. Ig watched him walk away. Brother Zeph wasn't prophesying. I think he meant to prepare us. He seemed awfully pleased. With himself, no doubt, Rachel said. She shook her head in disgust as she watched him leave. God forgive me. I know. That seemed to take a long time, so I'm going to hurry right along. Wherever there was Underground Railroad activity, the abolitionists had to rely heavily on the local slaves for information and for help in hiding fugitives. Rebecca as she was called, is a fugitive slave, or has been. She'd run away several times. She's a fictional character. There is a mix throughout the book of, fictional characters with actual historical characters, but Rebecca sprang from my imagination, and she has escaped several times, been captured several times. She's from a plantation in Alabama. That's where she was born and grew into young womanhood. Through a series of attempted escapes and being caught and resold, she's ended up in Texas. She now her freedom has been bought by the local abolitionist, and she lives, but it's a secret freedom, and it's sort of a freedom such as it is because freedmen or freed slaves just couldn't move around freely in Dallas County. And so she's basically posing as Joseph Shaw's slave, and she's living in his house and helping out with the work. And I just want to introduce you to her and read a short passage. She's in her bedroom at night. The men have gone to bed, and she's remembering her childhood on the McCutcheon plantation where she grew up. At about 10:30, Becca heard Joseph shut his bedroom door for the night. Though she'd closed her own door an hour earlier, her sense of solitude deepened after the men went to bed. She snuffed her candle and sat in the rocker next to the open window. Soft moonlight revealed the summer burned front yard and empty street. The gray shop cat sat on the front path stepping stone, watching for rabbits and cotton rats along the brushy margin across the road. Night was hers. You could be yourself while white folks slept, early to bed and early to rise, just like something a white woman would say, why, yes, ma'am, she'd be healthy and wealthy sure enough if she'd just get to bed at a decent hour. On the McCutcheon place, late spring had been best before the summer heat. Plenty warm, but you didn't sweat as long as you moved along easy, which she and her brother James and her cousins had rarely managed until she turned 13 and noticed that overnight, James's best friend, quiet, skinny Robert, had grown from half a head shorter than she to a head taller, and his quietness and shyness now seemed like seriousness, especially when he leaned toward her, arms crossed, one hand stroking new chin whiskers, which drew attention to his jawline and the size of his fingers and the great thumb, and he'd listen, unblinking, turning each of your words over and over as if he were studying and admiring a keen blade or a madstone or a fine carving. Cicadas and crickets and tree frogs, owls, 11 cabins scattered amid giant oaks and hickories and beeches throwing shadows across log walls, and the big house out of sight across the bottom and over the hill